Hi, Kathy.
Hello. So, really excited to be with everyone tonight, and we're going to talk a little bit about information warfare. And so I think we'll start off by just kind of introducing David, his background, how he ended up where he is, why this topic, and afterwards we'll want to open it up to a Q&A. So if you have a question, raise your hand or just yell it out. So yeah, first question. I mean, tell me more about what you're working on now and how you got into it.
Well, the way I got into it was actually kind of a strange story because I did my PhD in neuroscience of meditation, which is a pretty big shift from information warfare, except that I went into that because I was interested in, understanding what made a good life, how happiness and suffering from sort of a clinical point of view. And I went into this program because it seemed really interesting to me to take this sort of combination of, traditional wisdom and accumulated experience about how the mind can make people happy or unhappy, and then combine it with technology and see where that went. So by the time I graduated, I realized that it was a little too cutting edge to be a good candidate for a tenure track faculty position, but it was definitely something that people were interested in the tech world. So I came out here just in time for the world to go completely insane in 2016. And then there were kind of two things that came together. One of them was that I was already on this track of basically academics going through a re-education process to become data scientists, where you find some open source data and you build yourself a data science portfolio. And then the obvious kind of data that was very interesting was computational social science data, because everyone was talking about how social media could manipulate society and stuff like that around that time. So I focused on that and got into that because I realized that basically if civilization collapses, then it sort of, dare I say it, trumps some of these finer points of, did you have enough mindfulness to be happy when the taxi was late, or whatever. I mean, if there's like Nazis running rampant in the streets, then there are bigger issues which I never would have thought would have come up in my lifetime, and yet here we were. So one of the things that I was thinking that really influenced the direction that I took was I kept hearing people talking about how there was this deep state conspiracy of serious national security people who are somehow they were participating in a conspiracy to fight against the forces of evil that were trying to destroy democracy and collapse civilization, which sounds to me like people who are doing their jobs. So I went looking to see if there was in fact a deep state conspiracy, and miraculously I managed to find that there are in fact a whole bunch of national security people who are trying to do their jobs and who are extremely clear on exactly what's going on. Unfortunately, everyone in a leadership position in the defense and national security world is like a million years old, and they're kind of on the it's like a series of tubes track. So when somebody kind of showed up knocking, who's like, yeah, I'm from Silicon Valley, the younger national security analysts who were really trying to raise the alarm here were like, well, they won't listen to me because they're higher ranking and I'm lower ranking, but they'll listen to you because you're from a tech company. So there was a real synergy there in terms of being really, really welcomed into the community and getting a lot of opportunities to speak to people and to do a lot of networking and get access to a whole other perspective on things, by talking to people on the NATO side of things and stuff like that. So that brought me to that. That's like the sort of narrative side of things. And then maybe I'll ask you to cue me up for when, talking about the, more like the technical side of.
Yeah, so I guess a follow-up question to that, right, is what do you do day to day? What's your day like? What is it that you work on,
Well, you caught me in an awkward time for that question because I proposed two big things. One, to a Fortune 500 company to do a threat model for their ad targeting platform for how it might be misused for election manipulation purposes. And then I also had a meeting with the Department of Homeland Security to talk to them about consulting. And then that was all about 2 weeks ago. And then since then, I've been sitting waiting to hear back from everyone. So in the last 2 weeks, my days have mostly consisted of helping my friend who's I have a friend here who worked for me on my dissertation research, and now she's a grad student in neuroscience, so now I'm working for her when I have free time. Not really working for her, but I spend a lot of time helping her out because she did a lot for me. But before that, I would say that actually, instead of saying before that, I'm going to say after that, what I would like to see is to get the contract to do the threat modeling, because the key insight that we're trying to provide, me and my friends, is that, and actually I just really want to underline this here. So if there are two like bullet points that I want everyone to take home here, one of them is that when you hear people talking about, fake news or misinformation or alternative facts or whatever, and then you hear tech companies talking about, content moderation and we have to like ban the trolls or this or that or the other thing, I want everybody to think this is not a it's not a content problem. Like the problem isn't that, there's always been dreck on the internet and now the internet is bigger, so there's more dreck and it's just reached a threshold where we have to do something about it. That's not what's going on. It's a war. There's people who are doing bad things on purpose, and the kinds of things that you have to do to protect yourself when an intelligent entity is engaging in hostility against you are different than the kinds of things that you have to do to protect yourself when you're just in a dirty environment.
Okay, so maybe let's unpack that, right? So I think you've brought up a lot of different things. What's the landscape like, right? So what do you see as like the offensive players, as like the defensive players? When you say like intelligent entities, like what do you actually mean by that?
Well, the really big problem is that none of the activities in question are illegal, and none of them are expensive, and none of them are secret anymore.
And what are these activities, right? Like if you were to break it down for us, like what are these activities you're talking about?
So here's a little, I'm going to tell a story that I use to sort of illustrate the kind of process that we're talking about. So say you work for the oregano industry. You work for Big Oregano. And your boss comes to you and says, your sales numbers are below par. You need to get people to buy more oregano or you're out. And you say, oh my God, how am I going to get sales numbers way, way up? Like, I know from experience that if we do some sort of ad campaign, we can tell people that oregano is great and we can like move the needle a couple percentage points at a time if we're really lucky, and then when the campaign is over, it'll go back down to zero. So what do we do here? What would be a really bold, crazy thing to move things a lot more than you could with traditional techniques? So you come up with the idea of how maybe we could talk people into just buying and eating massive spoonfuls of oregano, and then your boss says, you're crazy. You better come back to me with something that works or you're fired. So long story short, you figure out that nobody's going to eat a spoonful of oregano just because you told them to. But if you suggest to people that they should try eating a spoonful of cinnamon, which is actually agonizingly painful and potentially fatal, that's so crazy that it's actually news if even one person does it. So you could make a fake video, and I'm not saying that anyone did this because there are still organic trends, not everything is being manipulated. But you make a fake video of somebody eating a spoonful of cinnamon and then having a whole lot of dramatic antics because they're suffering the agonizing pain of eating a spoonful of cinnamon, and you put it out on the internet, and before you know it, a whole bunch of drunk teenagers are going to decide that it would be a good idea to do this because they think it's funny, and drunk teenagers love to do self-destructive things. And before you know it, the cinnamon challenge is a thing, and there's like hundreds, I don't know, I think the statistics I read is that there have been at least 200 million views of cinnamon challenge videos within the short window of time that it was a thing. And what happens is that then the idea of eating spoonfuls of spices is not crazy anymore. I mean, it is crazy, but the thing is that it's on the radar screen. Like, everybody has heard of the idea of eating spoonfuls of spices. So now, Mr. Oregano, you can work with that. You can say, eating spoonfuls of spices is not crazy anymore. You can find a way to work with that, which of course didn't actually happen because this is a made-up example. But what you've done is you've basically you've created a subgroup of people who are doing something crazy, which widened the Overton window. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the concept of the Overton window, but there's basically a range of things that you can get away with talking about in legitimate news sources or media, and you can widen that like crazy. If you get a small group of crazy people to do some completely insane thing, then the mere fact that a small group of crazy people is doing a completely insane thing is itself news. The thing itself is still not a good idea, but once people are talking about it in the news, the actual way that psychology works, the way that the mind processes information, is that once you hear people talking about this concept, and that means it's in the realm of possibility for your thoughts. Even if you're only talking about it in the context of that's crazy. It's like the old concept of there's no such thing as bad publicity. It comes back to neuroscience and neurolinguistics principles having to do with how the brain works on associations rather than working on logic.
Okay, so it seems like you've got these examples of people are eating like cinnamon, then like bleach, then dumping ice over their head, and then Tide Pods, right? So like, what's like a more concrete example, right? Like how do we jump from like eating random shit that's under the sink to democracy? And like is there like a specific case study you've looked into, or like how do we take these psychological concepts, right, of people just trying things on the internet and apply it to like what's happening in policy, and how do we fight that?
So if you look at conspiracy theories online, back in the 90s, I used to listen to this show called Art Bell, because it was really entertaining just to be like, oh my God, like, wow, the things that people believe about pyramids or aliens or Area 51 or crystal skulls or the lizard people or the Anunnaki or whatever. There's like all these things, and they were just all over the place. There was never a sense of like a political aspect to it. And then from then until now, this thing happened where now everybody who's into conspiracy theories, they believe whatever their pet thing is, whether it's chemtrails or whatever, and then they also believe a small collection of politically motivated conspiracy theories, basically QAnon. Pretty much everybody who believes in conspiracy theories now, they believe crystals and QAnon, or they believe, lizard people and QAnon, or whatever, Sirius the Dog Star and QAnon. And QAnon is an explicitly politically structured conspiracy theory, because if you buy into that worldview, then it gives you a reason to think that one group of people is right about everything in a way that transcends any actual evidence of your senses. So
how do we fight something like that?
I'm glad you asked, because the answer is not head on.
Okay.
What you are definitely not going to do is you are not going to go up to someone who is a member of a cult, in the sense that they completely believe in a reality of alternative facts. This is another one. So one of the things that got me started on this is I'm from an academic background. I would talk to these academics who are doing research on fake news, and they're like, well, how do we educate people? And I'm like, you don't educate people out of being in a cult. Like when people are in a cult, first you kidnap them to get them out of the cult, and then you deprogram them. And that's not really an option when the cult is spread across the whole country. Like you can't kidnap people out of the range in which Fox News broadcasts are available. Like you can't kidnap people out of the physical territory in question. And you also can't reason people out of it. People get out of when you do cult deprogramming, you surround people with social pressure to adopt a new reality. And again, the social pressure problem isn't going to happen right now because there's too much social reinforcement for the cult worldview. So I noticed that there was a little bit of a garbling in the way that the things that I had suggested got translated into the Eventbrite thing. But the idea of misinformation Aikido, or one of my colleagues calls it misinformation jujitsu, because apparently jujitsu is actually the original martial art from which Aikido was later derived. So I'm, behind the times on that. But the idea is that you can't stop an attacker. Like you're not a steel wall, and you can't shoot them, like you don't have destructo powers, but what you can do is you can use their own momentum against them. Like they're going somewhere, and you can't stop them from going somewhere, and you can't stop them from doing something like what they're trying to do. But if you imagine, again, another analogy here is, say someone is going out and they're going to the town square and they're like yelling at people and they're getting an angry mob fired up with firebrands and pitchforks, and then they're like, David Perlman, he's a witch, he's a devil worshiper, we have to go burn down his house and, and kill him. And then the angry mob goes and then they kill this person that's your enemy, that you've just manipulated everyone into killing this person for you. And then you're like, wow, that worked really well. So then a week later, you fire up another angry mob and you like have them burn down the house of another one of your enemies. And you keep doing this over and over again, and it keeps working really, really well. You're never going to stop as long as it works well. Now, the academics watching this are like, ergotism? They're like, why is everyone crazy all of a sudden? And the answer is that everyone is crazy is because somebody figured out that they could make people crazy and then profit off of it. Like if somebody is doing something, it's because they can profit off of it, where profit, in a geopolitical context means something different than it does in a commercial context. So part of the lesson of applying security principles here rather than technology or content moderation principles is that the way security works is that you never solve a problem. What you do is that you increase the cost to the attacker so that it's no longer the most economical thing for them to do to use this particular exploit.
And what are you seeing kind of in the field now that you think is most effective in either introducing friction or kind of reducing content signal? Like what are the things that are working?
No one's doing it yet. But what they could do, what you can do is you get the angry mob, you go and you shout even louder and you shout even crazier, and you get the angry mob to go burn down the park or something, ideally. Or, like, honestly, if you get the angry mob to burn down a randomly chosen house, and like week after week after week, this guy never gets the mob to burn down the right house, he's going to stop because it's not working for him anymore. And then people will go back to their regular lives. Whatever that might mean, and their heads might still be filled with some nonsense, but they're not going to be having these angry mob parties every night. So what that would mean analogy-wise is that you have to put the infrastructure into place to analyze, the conspiracy theories and the craziness, and you see what the targeting is and what people are being used for and what the goals are that are being accomplished. Because, so in security, there's this idea of persistence where, you infiltrate a network, you get some code in there, and then you have, you use the exploits to get the payload into the target system, and then you let it sit there. Or maybe it's not that there's code sitting there that you've installed. Maybe you got the password, and then you just hold on to the password or something. Basically, you have the ability to trigger an event, and you hold on to that for a rainy day. You hold on to that for when the attacker has the purposes that they need. And if it's a really, really good exploit with really, really good persistence, you can use it over and over again. A lot of times in cybersecurity, in traditional cybersecurity, the field is advanced enough and the log analysis works really well, and there's a lot of good forensics and stuff like that. So once somebody establishes persistence, and then as soon as they pull the trigger, then the game is up, because then they'll go back and they'll analyze the logs, and then they'll figure out what happened, and then they'll clean it up, and then you can't use that persistence anymore. But we're not at that point with misinformation. With misinformation, if you think, what would be the analogy of persistence? If you go back to what I was saying about this, the cinnamon challenge. If you manage to get a bunch of people who are really, really into the cinnamon challenge, and you make it so that it becomes a part of their identity, that they do the cinnamon challenge on a regular basis or whatever, and they sort of define themselves in terms of this, and they heard about it from your YouTube channel or whatever, they heard about it from you, now a core part of their identity, which by its nature of being highly opposed to the rest of people, is very definitive. Like, it's a very important part of their identity because it's very different. And all of the information that becomes definitional to that part of their identity is coming from a specific source. So that source can continue to get this group of people to do whatever they want over and over again. So that's what persistence would be.
So when you
And
kind of
the
look
only-
at what's happening right across kind of, you've mentioned these particular like platform companies, kind of across all of them right now, whether it's YouTube or Twitter or Facebook, they're implementing a suite of policies that's either around content takedowns or maybe demonetization, or just kind of stopping the virality of certain types of inauthentic behavior. I mean, like, what's your take on, are these things working? Should we improve on them somehow, or is this like totally the wrong direction?
Well, let me be a little bit careful with some of the things that I say and totally not careful at all with other things that I say. The totally not careful thing that I'm going to say is that Twitter is an absolute dumpster fire. There was just a open shareholder letter published by Professor Scott Galloway, blanking on his last name, which everyone should read because it's a really good example of brilliant writing. And everything in there is completely true and matches my experience and the experience of all of my friends when we worked there. They're way too disorganized, and the leadership structure is too messed up to be figuring things out fast enough to do anything that needs to be done. Whatever opinions you might have about Facebook, the reality is that they are paying smart people good money to try to solve these problems, which means that, again, whatever you might think their fundamental profit motives are, they are not going to be able to avoid coming across some of the right answers, even if they want to. So Facebook is actually doing a pretty good job of looking into these things. And the kind of, like, I've had conversations with people at Facebook who had knowledge that they couldn't, that they couldn't say anything about, and I said a lot of this stuff, and they sort of like nodded and smiled, which is reassuring to me. And I've had the same sort of conversations with people at Google who are like, I can't comment on that, which is exactly what I want to hear. But I was at Twitter and no one would listen to anything I said. It was ridiculous. Twitter was really into this health metrics, and Jack kept saying, well, we need a thermometer so that we can find out if we're getting a disease and then we can treat it. And I'm like, no, you need a bulletproof vest because somebody's shooting at you. And they're just like, I don't know.
So what's like a practical recommendation you might make to someone at Twitter, right? Like how could they improve what they're doing right now? So I think different platforms kind of have different philosophies right now around data sharing and how much they open up their data to the academic world in terms of like how porous their recommendation intake processes are, right? And so, for example, Twitter has been on the forefront of releasing data sets around information operations and kind of making the archive available to the public, which is something that Facebook has not been doing. And YouTube is kind of like, not really engaged in this particular conversation. The question is like, okay, so given where the world is today, I mean, what's like a practical recommendation you might make to Twitter or YouTube?
Well, it's actually a little, in my opinion, it's a little bit past the point. I mean, if you imagine like a situation where there was a global plague and it got spread through air travel, and like maybe you could say, well, they should have been screening for the germs at the airports. But like once everybody on the planet has the plague, then it's kind of not really the airport's problem anymore. And that's kind of the point that we're at here. Like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, they should have done something a long time ago to stop things from getting so bad, but they didn't. And I don't really think there's very much that they can do to turn things around now, except to cooperate with whoever is doing it.
And what do you mean by that? Like, what do you mean by cooperate with whoever is doing it? Is it like academics? Are we talking about like the intelligence community?
Academics are not super useful. But then, of course, I left academics, so I'm biased. I think that there are a lot of people. I mean, honestly, my opinion is that somebody just needs to decide that they're going to do it and do it. I think that the right person to do it is an independent group of people who are smart and motivated and get together the resources and the knowledge. And that's what I've been trying to do. I've been trying to pull a team together and sort of bootstrap a thing that would have the ability to operate by working for the private sector. Because the thing is that everything that has happened so far has been motivated geopolitically. But there's no reason why Pepsi couldn't send an angry mob against Coke to crash their share price or whatever, or to convince people that somebody could insert into the into the QAnon world. Somebody could insert something in there that says that Pepsi is made with baby parts or whatever, and then it's not illegal for Coke to pay some gonzo SEO company to hire Twitter botnets and a bunch of whatever hacked social media accounts that you can do on the dark web, and to get everyone to believe that there are baby parts in Pepsi. It's not illegal. It sounds horrible, but it's not illegal. The only reason that Coke wouldn't do that is because they're not horrible, horrible, horrible people. And they know that if they get caught, that it would backfire. There's a lot of people not doing things because if they got caught, it would backfire. But it's becoming so normalized that, as soon as there's a really big incident of it, then the floodgates are going to open on the private sector. So what I've been trying to do is to get a team together to talk to the private sector and figure out who is at the leading edge. There's a few companies that I or my colleagues have talked to who are having these exact thoughts, basically like, somebody could do this to us. In particular, there are a lot of networking technology-oriented companies who are in direct competition with Chinese companies that are directly under the influence of the PLA. And so some of these companies are interested in asking these sorts of questions about what might go wrong for them.
Okay, so this is kind of like an interesting topic, right?
Yeah, I keep being like,
I think I think the particular point that you're bringing up, right, is like what we think of as like the cleanliness of our information ecosystems and what particular regulatory systems are in place varies a lot from geography to geography, right? So if we're in Europe versus the US versus like China, there are very different privacy laws in place.
Right.
And also kind of like the government itself has a very different perspective on like, how much oversight they should have on speech. So when you look at something that is like misinformation, or I think what we're really talking about here is disinformation, right?
Yes.
How much of the regulation should come from what are these kind of multinational global countries that have to companies that have to operate in multiple contexts, and versus how much should be taken on, let's say, by the actual governments of particular geographies? And should how clean things are on platforms be kind of, should that vary based on what geography we're in and what citizens actually can expect?
Wow, that was, I guess I deserved that, because that was a lot of high content questions all packed together into one place, which I've sort of been asking for that. So the different geography things, so there's a clear distinction between open societies and authoritarian societies, where there's a fundamental idea that information should versus should not be controlled by the government at all. And even in a place like Germany, where they don't have the same, they don't have the same sort of absolute constitutional guarantee of free speech with respect to the government, not with respect to everyone, which is an important point. Yes, you're not supposed to post you're not supposed to publish Holocaust denial in Germany, but basically, if you're not a complete fucking asshole, then Germany is not a problem for you. If you complain that you're being mistreated by your boss, or if you say that, you don't like the prime minister and someone else should be elected, or even if you say that the prime minister is a Satan worshiper, you can go around and say, you can do all that stuff in Germany, but you can't, post pictures of Winnie the Pooh in China. There's a distinction between an actual authoritarian information regime and not. And the interesting thing is that China is kind of not a problem for us. And that's a very controversial opinion that not all of my colleagues would agree with. But I know a lot of people who do business with China, and I think that they're like, some people project out, and a lot of the military people are really afraid because the military people are used to thinking of the question of who is a legitimate kinetic adversary, like who has a lot of bombs and guns and stuff like that. And China is really the only one that can stand up to the US in that respect. But if you look at it more from like, what do the countries actually want? I think the prevailing like philosophy in China has been more like harmonious relationship. Like they want China and, they don't. So I had a meeting with people at Homeland Security, and somebody there in cybersecurity said he had been giving a talk, and he said basically what I'm saying. He said, China, they just want, they might be interested in influencing US politics, but they just want like some sort of more favorable trade policies to be passed. Russia wants to watch the world burn, and that's a bigger problem for us. And then a little while later, he got called into the director of Homeland Security's office, and he said, yeah, the Russian embassy just sent us an official letter asking for clarification of your remarks and whether they represent the official position of the US Department of Homeland Security, or if they're just your personal opinion. But don't worry about it, those guys are assholes, we don't care what they think. So there's so many different distinctions between like different entities and different players and stuff like that. But for me personally, the part that worries me are the people who just want to watch the world burn. And there's a lot of people in America who just want to watch the world burn too. And I don't want the world to burn because I like people not burning. That was kind of what got me into this in the first place. As far as who should be doing things, I think that, so part of the reason that I had that long preamble is that I want to be able to post pictures of Winnie the Pooh or a giant orange chicken or whatever. Like, I want to be able to say whatever I want. And I don't really want, like, I have an enormous new faith that I never had before after I've met so many people in the defense and national security community, that there are people with really good, like really honorable people, like with really solid sense of duty and commitment to doing the right thing and supporting these principles. And actually, there's a whole other thing that I could talk about for a while about how a big part of what's going on right now in the US specifically is that the psychology of people who have devoted their lives to service is being weaponized against them. But I'm going to pass on that for now and maybe come back to that later if someone wants to chat about it. The important point that I'm trying to make right now is that despite all the faith that I have in those people, I don't like the precedent of saying that any part of the US government should really be the one to try to address this problem or change things. And that's why I was kind of going down the Batman route. And maybe I've just been, here in Silicon Valley too long, where there's this idea that like some billionaire is going to, jump up and be like, I know, I'll pay to solve the world's problems. And then I get a little bit, personally, I get annoyed when these billionaires are jumping up and they're like, I'm going to pay to solve the world's problems, which coincidentally are the problems that are super entertaining to me as an individual to think about in my free time, as opposed to I'm going to solve the world's problems that are actually what is going to kill most of the people. So, I don't know, maybe somebody might do something about it, or maybe this mechanism that I'm imagining is just inherently flawed and has no hope. But at the moment, I'm thinking of the private sector as like an indirect, I don't know.
Yeah, so as we kind of think about sort of like a single stakeholder versus like multi-stakeholder collaborative approach, right? Like how do you approach a kind of this dynamic in this space, right? Where kind of just the perception that there is like mud in the ecosystem, right? The perception that it's dirty is a goal of actors who are just trying to like blow shit up, right? So if you get a ton of new players who may have differing differing bars for like how accurate the leads they might generate are, or types of reporting that they may generate. How as an ecosystem do you kind of prevent essentially almost like incompetence as a way of muddying the ecosystem? Like how do we think about that?
I mean, in my opinion, the conclusion that I've come to with the way that I've thought about all this, which again, this is a little bit controversial, and I'd be happy to talk to other people who want to point out things I might not have thought about. But I think we're in a little bit of a, like, you got hooked by a fish hook and you have to push the barb all the way through in order to be able to get it out, which means that things have to get a little bit muddier before they can get cleaner. Because the only thing that's going to make things cleaner is when somebody stops having an incentive to keep muddying the waters. The waters are muddy because somebody has an incentive to muddy the waters. And if the incentive goes away, because the mud itself doesn't do them any good. It's, as you said, it's the perception that the waters are muddy. Like Russia, Putin, the mafia, all three of those things are essentially the same entity. They don't actually really give a shit which party is in power in the US. They don't care what the top marginal tax rate is. They don't care if we have health care, if we don't have health care. They don't care about any of that stuff. None of them care about any of that stuff. What they want is for us to be too disorganized to stop them from invading other countries. They want us to be at a standstill, confused and ineffectual, so that they can do whatever they want without us being in the way. So, it could be, it could have been another party, it could have been some party. I think one thing that I'm really curious about is back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was a real sense that the Soviet Union believed in their own nominal ideology of, like, Bolshevism and the workers' revolution and stuff like that, and seemed to be coordinating directly with people in the United States who were ideologically in line with their nominal foundation. However, even back then, an objective analysis would have indicated that what would have really suited them most would have just been for us to not be putting pressure on them and let them do their own thing. So it may have just been, basically I would love to talk to some historians who might be able to figure out what the real strategy was. Like, did they really care about socialist workers, or were they just trying to wreak havoc in the US like they are now? Because the people that they're supporting in the US right now, they don't care about those people. They don't care about their politics. They don't care what they believe. They don't care about the conspiracy theories. They don't care about any of that stuff. They're just making trouble. So basically they're getting what they want by making trouble, where making trouble is what the analogy of muddying the waters is. If they're not getting what they want, then they'll stop putting their effort into that plan. And then the mud, like when you, in my meditation world, they had these things where they teach meditation to kids by giving them these little jars that are like snow globes, where you shake them up and the glitter floats up, and then you just like hold it still and it slowly settles down. They're like, this isn't a metaphor for your mind. And then they'll tell the kids, like, when you get really angry, take your mind jar and shake it up, and that's like you're all shaken up. And then if you just like sit still, then it'll settle back down. So I think that I think the world is always a little bit crazy, but it's not this bad if people just don't fuck it up on purpose. And that's a real oversimplification, but basically things have to get a little bit muddier because there has to be a fight to stop the people from getting what they want. The other key point is that this battle, we're the weak ones. Like, we're outgunned by an enormous margin, because we can't do to them what they're doing to us, because they don't have an open internet. They don't have a free press. They don't have any of these things. Like, literally in America, ironically, even our current president signed a document that was written by the Pentagon that said, here's what our national security priorities are. Our biggest enemies are Russia and China. Terrorism isn't an issue anymore, but this global power competition is going to kill us, and we're really outgunned. And Trump signed it because he signed stuff without reading them. And sorry, I lost my train of thought there, because I get frustrated by a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, maybe this is a good time. I don't know how we are on time. Is it?
How are we on time?
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Okay, so does anyone from the audience have questions?
First of all, I just want to say thanks so much for coming out. This is super awesome to hear your perspective. What I wanted to ask is actually if to what degree are these social media platforms actually to blame? And the background on that is, let's look at like propaganda on the conservative side, right? If you've got, I have to be political here, say people like Laura Ingraham or Alex Jones, etc., but they got their start in the 1990s as they ran viral email lists and things like that at a time when there wasn't centralized control or management by a Facebook or anything of that sort. And they still were pretty effective during the Clinton administration. So to what degree are these problems just inherent to networks like this and not actively perpetuated by like the malfeasance of a particular company?
That is a really good question. And it's funny, there's like this sort of inside out thing where I had a really bad experience with Twitter, and a lot of people I know had really bad experience with Twitter, and they have a lot of problems there, and they're not doing their due diligence for things that they owe it to society to be doing. However, I also don't think that the social media companies are really the fundamental problem here. I think you're absolutely right. The implication of what you said, I agree with it completely. I don't think that this is really fundamentally a social media problem. I think if anything, I mean, where I was, I remembered my train of thought. Where I was going with that is that we literally have a situation where we have like old-fashioned mainstream television networks that are openly and unapologetically broadcasting the explicit propaganda from the people that our government has explicitly agreed are the biggest threats to our national security. And that would not happen in Russia. Like there is not a mainstream TV network in Russia broadcasting anti-Russia propaganda. And it wouldn't have happened in America in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s. So there was the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union, and then I think that all the national security people and a lot of different institutions were like, great, we're done. Like, we don't have to think about anything anymore. And there were a lot of things that were sort of afterthoughts for those people that turned out to be the most important thing later that they dropped. I mean, the main stuff that they dropped, so the non-afterthought was basically that after the fall of the Soviet Union, we were like, okay, we're not just about to have a nuclear war. Great, that's a big relief that we're not on the edge of nuclear war. I don't know, I'm probably older than most of the people here, but when I was in high school, you would look up and you'd be like, is that a missile? Like it's weird to think back and remember that, you know, that was what daily life in America was like. Most normal people, you know, and like TV shows would come out and they'd be like, oh, it's like another thing about what if there was a nuclear war. Oh, look, another TV show about what if there was a nuclear war.
Yeah,
everybody
for sure, right? Like
yeah.
when I remember when like Romney was running for president and he said the U.S.'s biggest adversary was Russia, people laughed at him, right? So there's definitely been kind of like a shift over the ages.
Yeah. So it's good that they stopped worrying about that, but then we also didn't worry about any of this other stuff.
Again, thanks. This is a fascinating topic. Do you think there's anything promising in sort of the, you know, economics and incentives, like, you know, virality lets these platforms, you know, make a lot of money. So if there's some way without necessarily baking in, you know, government enforcing content practices, but maybe it's like you have to be responsible in some way, right? Like forcing, maybe you view this as a negative externality that the platforms are imposing on society and making them scoop their own poop.
Yeah, a million times yes. So there's like these overlapping worlds of like, here's all these different problems that interlock and intersect. And Tristan Harris is he's like the figurehead of the whole movement of like the extractive attention economy and all the problems that come with that. So that sort of creates the ecosystem that this other stuff is adapted to operate in. The answer to your question was basically me saying that even though we have this like particularly viral ecosystem, I still don't think that that is really 100% to blame for this information warfare stuff. However, it's kind of like, you know, okay, yes, even though, you know, swine flu is not caused by people not washing their hands after they use the bathroom, still, please wash your hands after you use the bathroom. Like, really, let's just all do that. And it helps. Like, it helps more than it hurts. It would be great. And we should really do all this stuff. There should be, again, you know, it would be a whole other interesting conversation that actually, you know, probably Tristan and his crew are more qualified than me to, you know, to really deep dive on that. But you know, I do have thoughts about like the incentives. And I think just like you said, it has to do with kind of a speed limit thing so that things can't blow up too much. And that's part of why Twitter is really a bigger problem than Facebook or any of these other platforms, because Twitter is the fastest platform. Like, you know, YouTube has the most depth because you can go and you can watch, you know, like a 20-minute long ISIS recruitment video on YouTube or whatever. Not anymore. That is correct, that you can't actually do that anymore. And Facebook has the widest reach, where, you know, because everyone's grandma can find out whatever is going on. But on Twitter is where like somebody puts something out there and then 5 minutes later it's on every corner of the globe.
Just to say one interesting observation, because I know there's been some press on this recently, like this just goes to show the power of product decisions of these scaled platforms, right? Like Instagram doesn't have a retweet button and Twitter does. And so like the ability for things to spread really quickly is actually baked into business models, or, you know, PMs have influence over, you know, it doesn't come out of nowhere.
Yes, and the product decisions tend to gravitate towards a sort of like carving nature at the joints kind of thing, where like Twitter kind of ended up the way it is because the world wants there to be a really fast way to broadcast digital information. So if Twitter, one of the problems with Twitter is that if they, and this is the problem, one of the reasons Twitter has had a hard time making a profit is the same as this. If you take the Twitter flow, you know, the user experience, and you add one extra click, or, you know, 3 seconds or something like that, that's like 3 seconds opens up enough of a gap for somebody else to undercut them and be the new Twitter. You know, that's like 3 seconds takes them far enough away from the natural niche of what Twitter is that somebody else could come in and be like, we're 3 seconds faster than Twitter. And then that would be enough for them to, not right away because of network externalities, but eventually they could lose their position. So they have an incredible lack of freedom in what they can do there. It, you know, it makes it a very interesting, hard, psycho-technical question to figure out what to do with that platform. I think a lot of the things on the other platforms are a lot more straightforward to figure out what the trade-offs are, because you got more wiggle room to make trade-offs. Okay, anyway, somebody.
So to the extent that part of the problem is that these people that are taking the actions are kind of like outside of our general accountability circles, like we're not going to obviously get Russia to extradite any of its people to us. I mean, they're working for the Russian government, so that's a stupid way of putting it. But like, do you think that we can in any way try to create an incentive structure within the U.S., like within politics, where U.S. politicians are like incentivized to disclaim these sorts of information campaigns that are actually helping them? Right, like Trump sort of gets away with saying, well, look, there's no collusion or whatever, and maybe it's really true, like to your point, like Russia is just trying to muddy the waters. But like, how do we create a world where like the people in the U.S. politics, the people that are accountable to us, like the only way for them to survive is to like denounce all this, you know, disinformation?
So in order to answer that, the problem is that it goes back a really long way, because if you go back to, I mean, you could go back to Galileo and Copernicus, but that's a little bit of a stretch. You go back to the Scopes monkey trial, and then you go a little further along, you have Brown versus Board of Education, and you go to the Tobacco Research Council, and they're, you know, basically the American political right has a very long anti-science history, which is fundamentally at odds with the core values of conservatism. conservatism is not in and of itself anti-science in any way. And the people who are real conservatives, they have been managing the cognitive dissonance reduction by saying, well, you know, it's a trade-off. You have to break a few eggs if you want to make an omelet. And they're like, you know, okay, so, you know, we fight this lawsuit against the, you know, regulation of the tobacco industry, but it's more important because we don't want to set this, we don't want the courts to set this lasting precedent of government interference in the free market, which is also a core value. And what they were missing was that the trade-off that they were making had bigger consequences than any of them anticipated. So that was a willing compromise that was being made by honest, well-intentioned people who have, you know, a slightly different philosophical foundation than I do and slightly different value system, but at the core, not a fundamentally different value system. Like they believe in freedom, they believe in democracy, they believe in the, you know, truth, they, you know, they believe in science, they believe in all these things. They made a little bit of a trade-off, and I'm not sure, I could go back in time. I remember enough to know that I was angry about that at the time that these things were happening, whether you're talking about tobacco or global warming or whatever, like all these science things that have been going on for a long time. But I don't know if even if I could have said back at the time that these tobacco lawsuits were going on, no, look, you don't understand the precedent that you're setting by fighting this battle this way. Like, I just didn't agree with it. So that was why I was on the side that I was on, but I don't think I understood where the implications were going. And so I can't really hold it against those people for also not realizing what the long-term implications of using this sort of anti-science lawsuit strategy would be. However, now no one has any excuses. And if the world ever gets back to normal, or if America ever gets back to normal, what we need is people who are, like I said, honest, well-intentioned, like real serious conservatives who really very deeply believe in, you know, very low top marginal tax rates, which is the opposite of what I believe in, and believe in no centralized healthcare, which is the opposite of what I believe in. We need people who really believe very strongly in these things and who understand that it is not okay for them to use lies to get what they want. that will not work out well in the long run. And the only way for that to happen is for their movement to be set way, 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 way back as a result of everything happening right now, so that they will remember for a long time that that isn't a strategy that works.
Well, that seems like a kind of like a ending, like sort of fortissimo. So I think with that, I think we're at the end of our time as well. So we'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for coming in. A great conversation. And I think people are generally around for a couple more minutes, so feel free to mingle.
Yeah, thanks.